Welcome everybody. I'm here today with Richard McDonald. I've done an earlier interview with him talking about sexual assault. He's a lawyer working in Sydney and a former police prosecutor, over 20 years in the police force and working prosecuting mainly sexual assault cases. So we talked a lot about sexual assault, but I also wanted to discuss domestic violence with him, which of course is the other big area which is absolutely taking over our justice system. Richard, thanks for being here with me today.
It's a pleasure.
I really enjoyed talking to you about sexual assault. I suppose enjoyed isn't the right word. I mean, it was enlightening to hear from someone with such a depth of experience in this area, which we rarely do. But of course, there's an enormous overlap with the domestic violence area. And if we look at, I mean, sexual assault is comparatively rare compared to the number of people who are being accused of domestic violence, which I would describe as an absolute plague. I don't know what word you'd use. But I mean, that domestic violence has taken over our criminal justice system. Do you think that's a reasonable statement?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Most court lists in the local court are massively burdened with domestic violence matters. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I mean, you described that to me as the system has been perverted by what's happening in relation to domestic violence, the way that's being regarded.
I think the lack of scrutiny around the complaints themselves create a situation where if you have a statement about a domestic violence offence, then that person will be, more often than not, charged with an offence along with an apprehended violence order.
Yep.
Those two go hand in hand.
Yep, yep. I suppose we should go back and say, I mean, it happened for a reason. I mean, there are dangerous men out there. There are women who need protection from these men. And that's where the whole violence order system came from, and so it was done with good intent. Does it work? I mean, I suppose all of us would have in our minds examples of men who were determined to get the woman and who ended up killing them, even though they were littered with protection orders and so on. The piece of paper in the end may not do much good. Is that right?
A piece of paper is a deterrence only. It won't stop a determined offender from breaching that.
Yeah.
That piece of paper. So it does have significant force, and there are significant penalties that come with breaching a court order, because that's ultimately what an apprehended violence order is. It's a court order. Mm-hmm. However, that's little comfort to a victim that ends up on the wrong end of a breach.
But do you think overall, at its heart, it is doing some good in relation to those proper serious cases?
Yes, I do. I think it does have a lot of utility. It reinforces to the community that this type of conduct is not tolerable.
Yeah.
And by virtue of it being referred to as a serious matter or serious offence, domestic violence offence, it has that force of deterrence. But ultimately, nothing's foolproof. Nothing's nothing could be, unless you're going to lock people up, victims up, so they can't be interfered with, which is obviously not practical.
Yeah.
The system is not foolproof.
So we know why this happened, and there was an important social reason for setting up this whole system. But we also know that it's been absolutely taken over by utterly trivial accusations involving someone yelling at someone afraid that something could happen. You don't need any evidence of anything. You could just, the feminists have managed to expand the definition of violence to include everything, including now coercive control, whatever that is, behaviour that arguably has nothing to do with the law. It's normal domestic interaction. Anyway, tell me what you think about that.
So you talked about coercive control, that new offence that has recently been passed and is now in force. The problem with trying to regulate behaviour is it often captures behaviour that isn't criminal but can be made criminal, and the difficulty is how do investigators interpret that? That's an ultimate difficulty for investigators, because police are very practical people. They are used to dealing with a punch or a slap or a push. They're not used to dealing with patterns of violence or behaviours.
Do the police, are they tearing their hair out over coercive control? I mean, ordinary police must think,
Well,
what the hell?
I think the police are in a very steep learning curve, and they're not sure what may or may not constitute coercive control. Sure, the definitions are very broad, and they can actually include not allowing your child to use their mobile phone.
Yeah, anything. And the poor police are out there having to police this issue.
The general duties police, who are already enormously overworked and under-resourced, have to deal with these abstract concepts of abuse.
Yeah.
So that's a major hurdle, an educational hurdle for them to try to conceptualise. In my view, the only people that should be dealing with coercive control are detectives, because it's just too hard.
Richard, it's made up. The whole notion of coercive control was made up by a feminist who cooked this up as another means of locking men up and making it a criminal offence. I mean, this is not an entity for a detective to discover. This is all about conforming to a new script, all about weaponising, weaponised against men. I mean,
well, a lot of the elements in coercive control are already catered for in other offences.
That's right.
So we have an enormous...
Victoria decided not to hop on board the new coercive control.
We have an enormous overlap, right?
That's right.
We already have the same terms in the legislation around domestic violence, intimidation, patterns of violence.
It's all there.
It's already, we've already got it, and then we have it duplicated.
But why is that?
Another act.
Because it's a criminal offence. This is a more direct way of sending a man to jail, isn't it? Than having a violence order and then you have to get a breach to get him to go to jail.
Well, I don't think that it will in fact increase the chances of anybody going to jail, simply because it's so complicated. Why police are very practical. Why go down a complicated legislative path when you've got another more simple, equally serious offence in intimidation under the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Act? Well,
of course, what happened, it was introduced first in Tasmania many years ago, and the police totally ignored it. There were no complaints made. And then, of course, the feminist academics jumped up and down, the authorities jumped up and down, and they're putting pressure on. I mean, that's what happens, isn't it? I mean, you say they won't do anything.
It becomes trendy. It becomes trendy to charge people under this particular section, but does it have any longevity? I doubt it.
But when you say it becomes trendy, the pressure comes on ordinary police to take action from their superiors, doesn't it? They want to see their numbers come up. We've got the whole legislation was pushed through Parliament, and then it sat there for a year because they panicked, thinking women could be charged with this, women could be misidentified as perpetrators, and they announced publicly that they were going to train the police force to only prosecute men. I mean, what the hell?
Well, it's interesting because it's a cultural thing, because the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Act actually says in the objects of the Act that men are more likely to commit domestic violence than women. While statistically that may be true, statistics don't tell the whole story. It doesn't report those unreported cases where men are beholden psychologically. That's equally abusive by their partners.
Coercive control.
Yes. So in the context of that, the objects of the Act, then men are being more closely scrutinised than women over this type of offending. It's in the DNA of the Act.
Yeah.
So, and when police go and investigate domestic violence, they're automatically assuming that it is the male,
Yeah.
not what's happened. For example, I've turned up when I was in general duties as a supervisor, when I was a sergeant. I turned up to many domestic violence complaints where the male had been arrested and handcuffed. And I said, have you actually spoken to Mr. Logs about what happened? No. And I said, well, how do you say you could prove he may have a defence? Why haven't you investigated and asked questions? Sure, if he doesn't want to say anything, then that limits your choice around proceedings. But if you haven't even bothered to investigate or try to ascertain the other side of the story that may very well conflict and then impact your decision, then how do you say that this matter has any reasonable prospect? So this inherent bias in the legislation that men are automatically the perpetrators permeates through the culture of investigating domestic violence.
And you said to me that when police are routinely ignoring the actual DV policy, which requires them to look for sufficient evidence to support the criminal charges, and they're not doing that.
Yes, they're not.
No.
Even as a defence lawyer, they routinely charge first and investigate later.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I would argue that often it's never properly investigated, and it goes before a magistrate who goes through umpteen of these cases every day, giving them 3.5 minutes each, and it's never properly investigated. People are ending up and then they get a breach, and they go to jail. That with the evidence never being properly looked at.
I agree, and that's routine.
Yeah.
It's sad. I'm very sad to say that, having been in the police for over 2 decades, that police will focus on one part of the policy, that is, to encourage the charging of domestic violence offenders, but they forget...
That's in the legislation.
No, that's in the police policy.
Okay.
They say we encourage proceedings to be commenced where domestic violence occurs, but they don't look at that very second sentence, if there is sufficient evidence to proceed. That's routinely ignored, whether it's a lack of training or it's deliberately done.
Well, what do you think? I mean, the superior officers are putting pressure on them to push them through.
I think it's...
Are the bosses ever saying you must look for sufficient evidence?
Well, yes, they do, only when the matter comes to court, and then a phone call is made by the prosecutor saying there's no evidence here. And then the crime manager is then forced to make a decision. Well, if there hasn't been sufficient evidence or sufficient investigation, if we haven't closed the doors on any possible defences, then the matter has to be withdrawn. That's when a crime manager gets involved, is on the day of the hearing, when a call comes from the poor prosecutor, lumped with these matters, to have them withdrawn. Yeah. And then what happens? Costs are awarded. Thousands of dollars of costs are awarded against the police for failing to properly investigate.
I mean, the whole system is so screwed, isn't it?
It's dysfunctional, absolutely.
Totally dysfunctional.
Yeah.
When you were in that job, you said you refused to support applications for violence orders, which you felt were just there to assist in family law matters. That must have made you very popular.
I was never directly counselled in relation to that decision making, but it certainly, if a matter was to proceed, I wasn't consulted.
Yes, but I mean that was unusual because well, I'd better put it to you. I mean that would you say most violence orders are now being made in relation because of a advantage in family law matters?
There's an element to that, because invariably when somebody is charged with a domestic violence offence and an AVA is in place, then the family unit invariably breaks down and family law proceedings are commenced, or there are negotiations around the custody of the children,
Mm-hmm.
and an AVO is considered family violence in the family law space,
Yep.
and which then immediately impacts the father's ability to see his children.
Yep.
He may not see his children because of the imposition of that order,
Yep.
or he'll have to be supervised, and
Yep.
he'll have to pay for that supervision.
Yep.
Certainly, family law proceedings, these apprehended domestic violence orders are certainly, in my experience, have been used as leverage and continue to be in my current practice against men.
One of the things you talked to me about was the issue of the support groups. And I was talking to a guy this week who, I mean, it was an amazing situation, I mean, a hideous story, but he was able to get his wife, his malicious wife, charged for making false allegations because she'd been absolutely using the system, and he got a very senior police officer to help him. So that's so rare, as you know. But then she goes along to one of these support groups, the Domestic Violence Service Management, and they helped her, even though they knew this woman had been charged for making false allegations. They helped her hide the child from the father, move somewhere else away from them, compile more false allegations against him. I mean, just extraordinary. Not remotely interested in the truth of what she was saying, just wanting to promote her situation.
I'd even speculate to say that by deliberately hiding the child from the father when he has a right to see the child is something that a family court would frown upon.
Yeah.
And they're complicit in deliberately hiding the child from the father.
Yeah.
But that's not their function.
But there's no consequence for that organisation, which is doing this sort of thing all the time. And they're not interested in the truth of what a woman's coming to alleging when she comes to them.
There are no consequences when it comes to false allegations. I've said this previously, that there's no public interest in what they say. If you were to charge a complainant or a domestic violence victim with lying, it would re-victimise.
Yeah.
And the popular opinion is that we don't want to do that. But in my view, they're not victims until a court says they're a victim. They're a witness.
Yeah.
And they are under the same obligations as any other witness to tell the truth. So to suggest that we are re-victimising victims if they get charged for lying is, again, a nonsense. I think that's just a...
But what about all of these government-supported organisations who are, in effect, supporting false allegations?
Well,
what can we do about them?
Well, they need to be... Their decision-making needs to be audited.
Yeah.
They just cannot continue along the same... down a path where they're advising the people that they're supposed to be looking after unsupervised. They need to be They need to be provide reasons as to why they provided certain advice, certain facilities, all these sorts of things. To allow, it never happens in the police. Police are under constant scrutiny. They always have to justify their decision making. Why not these groups?
Yeah, I mean, well, this guy's taking legal action against them. I'd like to see some big cases against these organisations. That'd be a start.
Well, I think a lot of these organisations that they start with genuine reasons around protection.
They're supporting some genuine victims.
Yeah.
Right, and a very important role.
Correct.
But they are not interested in differentiating between helping women who really need help and promoting these lies.
Well, they would probably say, well, that's not what we're here to do. That's the court's role, right?
Yeah, but here we had a case where the police had charged this woman, so they knew there was something suspect in her.
So they should, with that in mind, to continue to support somebody who's been charged with a a criminal offence
Yep.
for making false allegations or perverting the course of justice, that person should not be provided with any further resources.
Absolutely. But they are, as we know. Now, one of the other areas I wanted to talk to you about are the magistrates. Because, I mean, they're on a hiding to nothing too, because they, I think you said to me, you know, they're making longer and longer judgments because they're ass covering, as we talked about. They're really nervous of getting public scrutiny if something goes wrong. So if they don't give a violence order in a situation, or don't send the man to prison or whatever, in a situation where some horrible violent act happens after that, then that magistrate will be in deep trouble. But one of the things you're saying is they're a very cranky lot in general. Oh, they have a horrible job, don't they?
They do. It's a very thankless job.
Yeah.
But they do have enormous responsibility to ensure not only that justice is seen to be done, but is actually done.
Yeah.
And that is the reason for these very long judgments. A lot of magistrates, they're highly conscientious people, just like myself and yourself, and they have an interest in getting it right, or getting it right as to the best of their ability. And the reason for that, in my view, is because of this constant media interruption in their ability to do their job. Yep. They're constantly criticised. Yep. They're human beings. They're not robots. And I'm very sympathetic to a lot of magistrates and the difficult position that they hold in determining people's life and liberty. Yep. They have to get it right, but it is certainly there is certainly a growing pattern where judgments are becoming longer and longer.
Although you did say to me that there are some magistrates who make very perverse decisions, full of inconsistency. So that it's a bit all over the place.
Well, some magistrates become very focused on a particular piece of evidence, and I guess that's where my right comes in to appeal their decision. Yeah. And I routinely do that. Yeah. So it's nothing personal against me. I recognise that, or against my client. And
it could sometimes be ideological. I mean, I know there are magistrates out there who are pushing the feminist barrel.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Just as anybody who believes in Catholicism or a form of religion, there are certain ideologies out there. They're human beings. They're not robots. Yeah. So they're obviously going to bring with them their life experience and their beliefs. Yeah. And perhaps their own personal experiences around sexual assault or domestic violence. I know, for example, that some magistrates who are no longer magistrates, who had children who were involved in horrific car accidents. Yep. And whenever a defendant came before a court for a negligent driver or driving in a manner dangerous type charge, they would always get a very heavy penalty. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. So, and then, but
they try to be as objective as possible, but sometimes the human condition takes over.
Yeah, but I'd also say we are seeing judges, magistrates being fed ideology. That we could. It's all out there. The manuals, the bench books that are systematically teaching these people to be biased against men, to favour the women, to believe all women. It's all there. So the indoctrination is in public sight, and it's not surprising that some of them are falling for it.
Mm. Well, I think they should be given more benefit than that.
Yeah, well,
the judges, I cannot point to any judge that I believe has behaved unfairly towards my client. Otherwise, I would have appealed, and I've appealed many magistrates. I'll just say that.
Yeah. Well, let's see how the Michael Lee judgment goes, where the complainant Brittany Higgins thanked him for his trauma-informed judgment. I think that rather sums up that situation. You know, that he... Anyway, I shouldn't go too deeply into that. I want to mention that there was another case this week, a terrible case of a female police officer in trouble for tasering a man. And this was a domestic violence incident, called to the house. She had a fellow officer there who got this guy down, the accused guy down on the floor, putting handcuffs on him. And then the female officer came in, he's lying on the ground, and she tasered and tasered and tasered at him. And the magistrate ended up saying this was inexplicable, gratuitous violence. And that, he's been referred for investigation, which is all as it should be. But I suppose it raises the question of good cops, bad cops. I've talked few weeks ago to what I regard as good cops who are very unhappy about the job they're being required to do, but they also said there were plenty of their colleagues who thought it was all perfectly reasonable. Tell me what your experience of cops in general is.
All police, the majority of police officers that I've worked with and know are honest, hard-working, have high integrity and love the job. They are professional. There's only a very small minority that ruin it for everybody. A very, very small minority. Having been a legal consultant to Professional Standards Command, it is a minority. A lot of police get in trouble not through necessarily corrupt practices, although that occurs on occasion, but it's mainly police are a reflection of our community. So they fall in the same traps as ordinary people do, domestic violence, all those sorts of things, predicated by their experiences in the job. They may be suffering undiagnosed mental health issues, PTSDs, which ultimately filter down into their own personal lives. But all that aside, the majority of police I respect. I still have friends in the police force that I communicate with on a weekly basis. And invariably, I think they do an enormously difficult job, a political job, and they're put under enormous pressure as a result.
But they're all, as we've said, they're in a system now where they're not able to do their job, really, because there's so much pressure on them to,
Well, that's right. A lot of
to ignore the evidence,
Well, police officers have their own. They can make decisions of their own, independent of whatever, in theory, of whatever is told from them from above. But invariably, theory is not the practice. They're put under pressure to commence proceedings, and
it's tough. Well, but my police officers I interviewed the other day made that very clear.
They're put in conflict.
If they try to charge a woman, they come under enormous pressure. I mean, it's not easy for them. Now, one more thing I wanted to talk to you about was the feminists are always claiming that domestic violence is across the board, equally common in all socioeconomic groups, blah, 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 which of course is not true. I know you've worked in, when you're in the, basic, what would you call it, the ordinary police force, you were in Bankstown, which has very strong ethnic communities. And you said to me that there were real issues in terms of certain cultural groups being much more likely to perpetrate domestic violence.
So when I was the senior sergeant in charge of the prosecutor's office at Bankstown, majority of that work was domestic violence related. Bankstown at that time had the greatest charging rate for domestic violence related offences, but the lowest conviction rate. And that was mostly because the victims or the witnesses didn't turn up to court. And
that was a Muslim community mainly?
Mainly, yes. Yeah, majority of matters in Bankstown that I saw were from the Muslim community, yes.
And it's so there's a real cultural element there. And of course we're not allowed to talk about that. And we're not allowed to target particular community, the Indigenous
it's just a fact.
Population is the same. And we can't talk about that.
Well, I'm not speculating. It's the truth.
A fact. I know, but
Yeah.
but the fact is being ignored because of the ideology that it's equally common. And anyway, so it goes on. Yep. I think we're going to have to wind this up, Richard. I could talk to you forever. But I just want to tell people that I was really pleased to discover that one reason you decided to get out of the police force was that you were just horrified at the way some police acted during the COVID lockdowns. And you didn't want to become a brown shirt.
I had, my position was as a legal consultant for a lot of senior police around the public health orders, and I wasn't terribly pleased with some of the decision making that occurred in that space.
I hope that's under us. I want to say that again.
I'm being diplomatic.
You're being very diplomatic.
But ultimately, nobody's forcing me to be in the police force, and I took that decision independently to when the opportunity came to leave. And I'm glad that I left. But the police also gave me immense opportunities,
yep.
which I'm very grateful for. But it wasn't only the conduct that I witnessed, but also the conduct of other police forces in Australia during COVID.
Yep.
That really disturbed me, like in Victoria. I was very disturbed from the point of being a sworn police officer at the time at some of the conduct that went on there. And I just simply didn't want to be a part of that.
Well, good for you. Anyway, the fact that you're now out on your own as a lawyer in private practice is a great asset for us, I feel. I'll enjoy working with you in the future and referring people to you.
Thank you.
Because in fact, you've certainly had unique experience that would be of great benefit to any client.
Absolutely.
Seeking your help.
Yep.
Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Tina.